Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly podcast series, Journeys of Challenge. This week, we're honored to host a special guest here from Israel, Jonny Daniels, the founder of the organization Beneath the Depths. Beneath the Depths is dedicated to educating the young generation about the memory of the Shoah and the various challenges that survivors go through. And we're going to hear much about that organization today, and in general, some of the challenges of perpetuating the Zachor of that catastrophic time. So I just want to thank you, Jonny, for coming on and taking time out of your valuable schedule and joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's my first time here in Jacksonville. It's a beautiful place, and it really is a pleasure to be able to come here and speak to you and your audience of your wonderful congregation as well. It's a big honor for me to be here. So thank you for having me.
All right, it's our pleasure. So if we can just start, maybe take a step back, and if you can tell us a little bit about the organization from the depths and why you started it, and just a little bit about the mission of the organization.
Absolutely. Well, I grew up in London, England, as you can hear from this difficult accent.
It's hard to tell.
It is. It is hard to. Well, some people think I'm South African, others Australian. People have fun with it all the time. But I was born in London, England, and my great-grandfather was a Polish Jew. He came from a small town in the north of Poland called Dobrzyń nad Wisłą, and he was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. Every single member was killed. And my grandmother grew up as the only daughter of this survivor. And it kind of was there my whole life, like a lot of us, right? We grew up in different times where, the numbers on the arm was something that we were used to seeing, and Holocaust survivors were around us all the time. And it played a massive impact in my life. It was always just there. So much so that eventually when I made Aliyah and I moved to Eretz Yisrael and I joined the army, and every experience was somehow, there was a connection to a survivor. There's a whole section of stories and sequences of incredible things that happened to me that were somehow connected to Holocaust survivors, to the point where after my service in the army, I ended up joining and working in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. And there in the parliament, still somehow Holocaust survivors played a part in my journey there. And I became very close to a well-known Israeli journalist at the time called Noah Klieger. He was the I think longest serving journalist in history, something like that. And he was a survivor of Auschwitz, and he was a reporter for Yediot Ahronot, which is Israel's major broad street newspaper. And Noah and I would speak often. And the system in which young people were learning about Shoah, and there started people would refer to as Holocaust fatigue. People were getting tired hearing about it all the time, was something that was very worrisome and bothersome to him. And that kind of came onto me. And so even through my time in the Knesset, it was something I was looking at very much. And then we came up with an idea together. And in 2014, for the first time in history, I created an organization, and my organization took the Knesset out of Israel. So we took the majority of Israel's parliament outside of Israel for one day. We flew with 2 airplanes to Auschwitz, and we held a session of the Knesset in Auschwitz.
Wow.
Which was, you can't get more of a symbolic event than that. Truly, each member of Knesset was accompanied by a survivor of the Holocaust themselves. And for the survivors, many of whom have been back many times, for them, this was like the ultimate closure, right? That the thought that they'd survived this was something that they wouldn't have imagined. But then to come back with the parliament of the state of Israel was something that was just really a very, very, very powerful event. And we were joined by hundreds of international parliamentarians. There was a congressional delegation from the United States and really all around the world. And I understood at that point that there is what to be done from a younger generation. And at the time I went prior to the event and I sat with Eddie Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha. And I sat with him and I said, look, I'd like to be involved in this subject and maybe help educate on the Holocaust. But who am I? I'm obviously not a survivor, right? I don't have letters before or after my name, right? I'm not, a learned rabbi like yourself. How can I discuss such a thing? And he said, Johnny, you have it all wrong. He said, if your generation don't stand, if you don't stand, you're my witness. If you don't become the witnesses of the witnesses, then everything that we fought for, all that we went through, all of this is going to be lost. And that really gave me this inspiration to do this initial event. And then after that, everything else just started to fall into place. Suddenly, from everything, we've been dealing the last 8 years with the most incredible things. The event we held in Poland, so there was a huge amount of media in Poland at the time. And people saw a young man involved in the subject. I did a lot of television and podcasts in Poland. And people started to reach out with stuff that you can't even imagine. People started hundreds of emails on just one subject, matzevot, Jewish tombstones. In pre-war Poland, there were 1,300 Jewish cemeteries. That's more Jewish cemeteries than there are in the United States, right? That's based off the fact that, Jews lived in a shtetl, in small towns. You had bury quick, as we know. So every shtetl, every town, every city, every village had their own Jewish cemetery. Now, during the Holocaust and after, almost all the cemeteries were completely destroyed. Completely. What they do during the time of the German Nazis and after Poles themselves would take these stones because they're valuable building materials. And they'd use the matzevot for rebuilding during the war and also after with the destruction of Poland. And we'd receive these phone calls where suddenly you're seeing people are calling me up. We're refurbishing our house and we figured out that half the house is built from matzevot, from Jewish tombstones. So we'd go and help them remove the tombstones and return them to the cemetery. From a halachic perspective, right, from the religious perspective, there's no kedusha, there's no holiness it's just a stone. But the symbolism was important. It was a closure to the people who had done it and to the generations that came after them. And it was also a symbol that we take care of this stuff. So, in total, we ended up dealing with hundreds of thousands of fragments of Jewish tombstones, returning them to the Jewish cemeteries. We ended up dealing with projects you can't imagine the amount of things. One small story I'll share is that we partnered with the University of Warsaw, and we had students in the north of Poland going from house to house, speaking to locals, because I knew there was a Jewish cemetery there and it was completely destroyed. And usually when you go and speak to them, they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that we paved this street with tombstones. The Germans forced us. It happened often. And at that point, then we're able to go and put a bit of political pressure on the city, and they'll dig the road, and we find the whole road's made from matzevot, from Jewish tombstones. And they were going from house to house, and they ended up at the home of a very simple Polish shepherd. And they knock on the door, simple house. And they said, would like to come in, and he invited them in, sat them down, and offered them tea, and he said, what do you want? They said, look, we're doing this project where we're looking for traces of Jewish memory. And he went white. And the students started looking at each other, didn't understand what was going on. And he just stopped and he couldn't say anything. His wife comes out and says, tell them. He said, I can't. He said, tell them. He said, well, look, are any of you Jews? And they said, no. They said, well, I need a Jew. So they called me up and I came straight to the house. I walked in and the shepherd looks at me and he's welling up his eyes. And he's looking at me, he says, listen. He said, I remember the day, at the time it was 70-something years ago, when they came to this town, a small city, town, village called Filipov. I remember the day that the Germans came and rounded up the Jews. I remember because my neighbor was the rabbi. Wow. I was a little boy. And I remember looking through the window and watching all the Jews being taken to the city center. And I stood and I was peering through the curtains. And I was just watching. I couldn't stop watching. And then I saw something peculiar that I'd never seen before. I saw this old rabbi, this white beard. I saw him running. And suddenly he's running in my direction. I got very scared and I screamed. And my father realized I was looking, pulled me away and said, do not look. Just don't look. So we went back inside and there's silence and fear, great fear. The Germans are in the town. And suddenly, boom, 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 there's knocking on our door. Now my father went to open the door and I went with and I stood holding his trouser leg. The door opens and the rabbi's standing there. He has something in his hands. He pushes it on my father and he says, look after this until I come back or another Jew comes and knows what to do. And at that point, the rabbi left. I don't know what happened to him. I later found out that on that day, the Jews were all taken to Treblinka, the German Nazi extermination camp, and never all of them were killed. Every single one of them. No survivors. And so I said, okay, what did the rabbi give you? He said, stand up.
Hmm.
I said, okay. I was sitting on the sofa, and he lifts up his sofa, and lying on the floor is half of a Torah scroll.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. I quickly ran and picked up the Sefer Torah. Seeing it on the floor was quite shocking. I picked it up and I held it, and he was crying because he understood, and he turned around to me and he said, I've been waiting for you for 75 years. The rabbi told me you'd come.
Wow.
Completely overcome with emotion. I didn't really understand at the time. It's shocking. And I asked him, I said, well, there's half. Where's the other half? He said, oh, we had no choice. We used it. I made my wife a handbag. We made insoles for our shoes. The simple people, they didn't understand.
Yeah.
It was material. They just used it. And I stood there holding the Sefer Torah in this farmer's house in the north of Poland. And at exactly that point, I realized I was holding the last survivor from that village. I realized I was touching the last connection that we have to 800 years of Yiddishkeit from this area. And so at that point, obviously, had I have called a rabbi, he probably would have told me to take it to the cemetery and bury it. But what we decided to do, with consultation with other rabbis, I asked the correct rabbi, right? So, is that we decided to rewrite the missing part of the Sefer Torah. And we've done it in a very unique way. It's a process that we started. It stopped during COVID, unfortunately, but we started to rewrite the letters, the missing letters in the Sefer Torah, and the only people who are writing the letters are survivors of the Shoah.
Oh, wow.
And so, we've really been, very lucky. We've done events in, all around the world. And Ritz Hashem, in the near future, will also bring it here. Please go to this community, to your Holocaust survivors. And it's an incredible educational tool. And it's something that seems so small. It's one tiny story. But through this, the education that you can bring and the people that you touch through this is just unbelievable. And so this is one of many, 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 many projects and many things. This is just one day in 8 years.
Sure. And
so beyond that, the foundation is working on education in as many ways as we can. We try and look out the box. We try. I'm not an academic, and so much has been done in the academic sphere. So many books have been written. You ask yourself, how was so little known? And that's also because we haven't necessarily dealt with it in the other way. We had Ray Allen, who the NBA All-Star, a basketball player out in Poland with us. We even had Mike Tyson.
Really?
Yeah.
Boxer?
The boxer. We had Mike Tyson in Poland. We took him to the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. And people said, what are you doing? It's Mike Tyson. It's not the right image. I said, you crazy. I said, his millions and millions and millions of social media followers are exactly the people who need to be hearing these messages.
Yeah. Maybe you can take some other current NBA players. We won't even mention their names. Yeah. But I'm just curious, just a follow-up question on the Matzevos. How, so many years later, can someone recognize that it's a Matzeva? Is it their Hebrew lettering on it, or is that the indicator?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a stone, and often when they were placed, they'd be placed upside down, right? Because people understood what they were doing.
Right.
And they didn't, it's not a very nice thing to have a tombstone in your house, regardless of whether it's a Jew or a non. So they put them upside down. And inadvertently, by placing them upside down, you end up protecting what's written on the matzeva. I've pulled up matzevas with, you had this incredible thing in pre-war Jewish Poland where there'd be often colored matzevot. Even the Hasidic communities that paint them red, paint them this color, the letters would be golden. And because the matzeva had been placed in the earth face down, we're putting it up as if it was exactly how it went down. And so this is how people find out. Often they don't realize that they have it. They're doing refurbishments and they're like, oh, goodness, what's this? And it's quite well known in Poland, this phenomenon. So people will then reach out, usually to us, and let us know that this is there, and we'll go and pick it up and help them.
Wow. Wow. And do you restore them to a cemetery, or how does that work?
So we're taking them back almost always to the area of the local Jewish cemetery if it's still there. Often, there have been movement to return, to regate Jewish cemeteries and refence the areas off. You have a huge plot of land with like 1 or 2 stones there, right? Which pre-war would have been packed with Jewish tombstones. So in that case, we'll bring it back to that area. If there is no longer a Jewish cemetery, then we'll just take the matzevot somewhere else.
Right.
And often they're broken in half, and you can't always, we're never able to place the matzeva where the person was buried, because those documents were also almost always destroyed. But again, it's the act of returning this that gives a level of decency and closure to the place more than anything else.
Right. Let me ask you a different question, if I can, Johnny. In 2019, actually, I went to Poland for the first time. I was just there once, and tried to organize a group from here, from Jacksonville, to go. We ended up having a rather small group come with us for whatever reason, but there were quite a few people that resisted going for this is their stated reason. They said that they don't want to go back to Poland, and they don't want to support the economy there. There's so much anti-Semitism and Jews that were killed, and they refuse to go back. I'm just curious, for someone that goes back regularly and has these meaningful experiences, what is your take on that? How would you respond to that?
This is an answer for many podcasts, truly, and it's kind of a weird and unique phenomenon, right? And for the listeners who are hearing this, your statement is something that is known to be true, right? So my answer, I request that they listen with an open mind,
right,
because it's not always how it seems. And I'll try and break it down in the simplest way possible, and the quickest way possible. Look, there's nowhere, anywhere, that was ever really good for the Jews, right? We can start with that. I'm from London, from the United Kingdom. In 1066, you had the massacre in York, where hundreds of Jews were mass murdered by the locals in the north of England. Throughout our history, we've had many, many difficult times, difficult places. The Shoah, the majority of it happened on the ground of Poland. There's no doubt on that. The perpetrators, mainly the people who pushed it and made it happen, were the Germans. A lot of the people who won't go to Poland have no problem going to Germany. Now everybody's talking about the support of Ukraine. The Ukrainians were way worse than almost anyone in terms of how they dealt with the Jews during the Shoah. The Poles, in themselves, if we're talking just about Poland, for example, there were no Polish guards at concentration camps. There were no Polish SS units. The Poles were also treated incredibly badly by the Germans. The reason why Poland got such a bad name out of all of this was because it happened there, and also because you had the largest population of Jews there pre-war. Now, it's not to say that it was great for Jews in Poland, because it really wasn't. There was many difficulties. My great-grandfather, the reason why he survived was because he was beaten so badly by Poles before the war, he left Poland. He had a dent in his head his whole life because he was smashed in the head. So whilst Poland was a very anti-Semitic country, there weren't pogroms the same way that there were in Russia, for example. It was a different kind of anti-Semitism, a lot of verbal anti-Semitism. And it's not, to be honest, unfortunately, too dissimilar to what we look at today, even here in the United States. When you're looking, again, this crazy anti-Semitism of, you Jews, you Jews, you Jews. It was very, very similar to when you actually understand the history of what happened on the ground in Poland. In the interwar period, things were very, very bad. So who are you going to blame? Us, obviously.
Of course.
Of course. The same way that here in America, you're doing the same thing. Right? And of course, there were cases where unfortunately, Jews were killed. Here in America, this is happening as well. So, when we look at anti-Semitism in terms of where and how and all of this stuff, it's kind of incorrect to point to Poland as like a specific case of it was absolutely like the worst there, because it wasn't. It was very, very bad everywhere. And the notion of not coming to give Poles your money is also, it's not, it truly, doesn't make a huge amount of difference to their economy, whether people come or not. They have millions and millions of tourists every year. Whether a few people, even if it's 1,000 people come, it's not going to make a difference really to anybody's life. In fact, the only people who are making money for you are probably Jews who all have the kosher restaurants there, who run the tourism services there for the Jewish groups that come. And in terms of current day anti-Semitism, whilst of course there is anti-Semitism in Poland, there's been no physical attacks on Jews in the last 10 years, not anything even close to it. Again, there's verbal anti-Semitism. Of course there is everywhere. But the shuls have very little security. Here in America, you can't imagine a shul without a policeman outside, an armed guard. In Poland, that doesn't exist. To be honest, you could even go as far as saying that Poland is actually safer today to be a Jew than here in America, which is a very big statement, but unfortunately, factually correct.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'll just anecdotally, I'm not as well traveled as you. But when I was in Poland, one night, my wife and I and one of the members of our group, and there was another rabbi that was taking our group around. We walked around, downtown one of the cities there, and I was wearing my yarmulke. The other person was wearing a kippah as well, and we felt fine, very comfortable. And just to contrast that, several years ago, we were in Paris,
Huh.
my wife and I, and one of the French Jews came over to me and said, "No one wears a kippah here." And I'm like this naive American,
Right.
who wear a kippah anyways. If you have to cover your head, wear a cap.
Right.
Because no one wears a kippah out in public. So just that's not the only data point, obviously.
But however, that is something that is felt, meaning that again, look, this is also for another reason, and also not to be too political, but it's also connected to the kind of we're facing less Christian anti-Semitism today in Europe, and as much as we're facing extremist Islamic terrorism. Now, I can say this as someone who grew up in the United Kingdom. I know this. I see this firsthand. The kind of worries and problems that we're having in Europe and France, this isn't being perpetrated by Christians. This is being perpetrated by immigrants and unfortunately in the name of Islam. And in Poland, you just simply don't have that. You're a curiosity, right? But they're very used to it in Poland. There's so many Jews walking around with the yarmulke. I'm very, very public and very well known in Poland. I've been many times on the TV, front pages of magazines. People know who I am. People look at me in the street, ask for selfies even sometimes. I have never, ever, ever experienced physical anti-Semitism. Once again, this isn't to say Poland's a wonderful place, because it isn't, right?
Right.
And I, much prefer to be home in Israel, but it's definitely safe enough to come on a tour. It's definitely safe enough to come visit. And the power and importance in visiting a site like Auschwitz-Birkenau, or Sobibor, or Treblinka, or Majdanek, all of these places that are on the ground in Poland that were built by the German Nazis during the occupation, these are places that outweigh any fear or any worries that you may have. These are places that are critically important for every Jew to visit, without doubt, and every non-Jew as well. But most definitely, from your community, if people, they should be sending their children. I thought I knew everything when it came to the Shoah. I'd read every single book. I'd done all of this. I went for the first time myself when I was 26 years old to Auschwitz, and it changed my life. It completely changed my life, because being there and feeling it, and being witness to what happened, and being able to say Kaddish if that's what you want to do, or say Tehillim, or to have a feeling of connection to that place, and in remembering, is outweighs, in my opinion, any kind of feelings that you may have as to not wanting to go there.
I definitely hear that. Which kind of leads me to my next question. I mean, here we are at the 2022, the end of 2022, and we're in an era where the amount of Holocaust survivors still alive are dwindling rapidly, just due to their age. I mean, the youngest Holocaust survivors are in their 80s now. Some are in their 90s, and we're soon going to be faced with the uncomfortable reality that there's no Holocaust survivors left alive. And when that happens, I mean, just to give you a little background, a little taste locally of that. So every year there's an annual Yom HaShoah event here in the community, and different synagogues take turns hosting it. So I think it was in 2019, so this goes back 3.5 years ago, we had this program where, we have invite 6 Holocaust survivors and to light 6 candles as part of the program. And to be honest, we couldn't find 6 Holocaust survivors, living Holocaust survivors. We had about, I think, 3 that were healthy enough to come. Doesn't mean there were no 6 Holocaust survivors in Jacksonville. So we ended up having like 3 Gen 2,
right.
Children of Holocaust survivors. So this goes back through, just as one anecdote. So I guess my question to you, as someone that's in the field and living and breathing this all day, is like, what do you think the best way to perpetuate the memory of the Shoah is once we're going to be in that era sooner rather than later. There's not going to be any living Holocaust survivors that can say, "Look, I was there. I was there. This is what happened. I saw it with my own eyes." We're not going to have that. So, how do we keep the Zachor alive?
I think, like everything, it stays inside of us, right? It's kind of like, you look at the Haggadah, right? When we sit down and talk about it once a year and we remember it and deal with it. I don't think we have any choice but to be like that and make sure that this is something that is etched into who we are as human beings, right? And I think that this is also a very big fear. And I think that this probably the problem is much bigger with the generation of my children, right? Our children, presumably young children, because once again, like for almost all the people who will be listening to this, we know Holocaust survivors. We've grown up around that. There's a Holocaust survivor named Edward Mossberg, who was truly like a grandfather to me. The last, especially over the last few years, been there for me, speaking multiple times a week. Really an absolute mentor and a guiding light for me. And he was in Mauthausen in Austria. And there they didn't even bother tattooing the Jews because it was obvious they were going to die so quickly. So they gave him like a plaque with a number and they had to like wrap it around their wrists. And so he actually made me a bracelet with an exact replica of his number. And when he gave that to me, he said, "Jonny, wear it every single day. And people will ask you what it is. And when people ask you what it is, you'll remember me and remind them my story." And, I'm not saying that everyone has to do this. It's a very, very heavy and very difficult thing to bear a number on your wrist. But it has to become part of who we are more. And we also have to get younger generation involved more, right? Again, the difficulty often when it comes to Holocaust education is there's what's perceived as Holocaust fatigue. And I truly believe it depends on how we teach it. As time goes on and there's less survivors around, we also have to think about maybe slightly different ways to teach it. Because, this shock of 6 million and murder and all of this stuff, often for young generation, they just are unable to process that they don't get it. It's too big. It's too scary. They turn off. This is why one of the things that we do as a foundation, one of the things we do anyway, is we have a huge focus on what are known as righteous amongst the nations. So non-Jews who risk their lives to save Jews during the war. Many people would have heard of Oscar Schindler, and for them, that's the image of a righteous. When over the last few years, we've on ground helped them in many, many, many ways. As of today, there's only 139 of them still alive in the whole world. 139 righteous amongst the nations still living. These upstanders of the Holocaust, people who risked their lives to save Jews. And, the state of Israel, Yad Vashem, gave them a medal, an honor, a title, and then we kind of just let them be. And when I started and realized what was going on, I was like, where's our Hakarat HaTov? Where's our Thanksgiving as a Jewish community? Right? These people should be, living like kings. They, you look at today, right? And some idiot sports person or celebrity says something about Jews, and we're all just waiting for someone, a non-Jew, to say something nice about us, right? To say that wasn't true. And when one non-Jew says something nice about us, everyone's like, "Oh, wow, someone said something good about the Jews." But imagine going further than that and risking your life and your children's life to save a Jew. You can't imagine what that would be.
Yeah.
And these people are at the end of their days. And what I found is often by sharing their stories, it's an easier way of entering into the Holocaust education, because what we do then is when you talk about the good, it's easy to bring up also the bad. So you can, educate young children, speak about the fact that, look, there's a difficult time, there's this, you're risking your life and your family life to save someone. And it was so difficult because all of this bad thing were happening at the same time. Then it brings up a question of what would you do? Would you be able to be like that? Would you save? Would you protect? How would you? What are we doing today within our communities? Even in terms of cyberbullying at school, or as a broader, what are we doing as Jews for the Uyghur community in China, right? Are we standing up for people who are being killed again now? What's our role in all of this? And these are important questions that often lead to Holocaust education in maybe a slightly different way.
Right. Wow. So only 139 known righteous amongst the Gentiles. That's also a number that's dwindling.
Yep.
So you identify them and you engage with them and show them Hakarat HaTov and
when COVID started, I went straight to Poland. You know, I Baruch Hashem, I have two beautiful daughters who live in Israel, and they weren't best pleased. I thought I'd be going for a month or two, and I went to Poland, and I spent almost 2 years driving through Europe. I visited over 21 countries.
Wow.
I visited every single living righteous, all the way from Albania, where you have the last living Muslim righteous, which is a remarkable story.
Wow.
Through Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, Germany, everywhere where there are still righteous living, we visited them, and the idea, the purpose was to help them stay safe during this time. And like, what bigger mitzvah could there be? Like, the amount of the feeling of gratification on a personal level was incredible. You know, I'm mamish have the opportunity to help keep these people safe. Someone who risks their life to save a Jew, there's no massive risk for me, right? I'm going to the supermarket and buying them groceries and bringing them their medication, right? You know, my risk was virtually nothing. But the fact that I was able to help keep an old person safe during this period was an incredible feeling. And then we've continued this, and around Hanukkah time and their festivals, we help them celebrate their festivals as well. So I go to them every single year, and I'm going back actually now to Poland from the United States at the end of this week. And then I start a month's road trip where I drive to all the living righteous with these huge boxes full of everything they need for their holidays. I even bring each one a tree for their celebrations.
Wow.
That's a very weird thing for a Jewish boy to do. Is that the first time I tried to buy, and at the beginning there was 260. I had to go and buy 260 trees. You know, you know how to hold them. You know, it was a very strange experience. And I gift them all trees so they can celebrate their holidays how they want to.
Wow.
And it's a pretty special thing to be able to do.
So you drive all over Europe doing that.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Fascinating. And can you share, you know, anything that comes to mind? You mentioned the Albanian, but I don't know if you want to share that story, but any particular things that jump out at you, like a remarkable...
The thing is, every single one of their stories are remarkable. Like, you know, people always say, well, what's the best story? I'm like, truly, like, every story could be a Hollywood movie. Every single one. And it's even to the level of just... You know, they're obviously the big cases, right, of saving thousands of people, but it's often the cases of saving just one. About a year and a half ago, I was in Belarus, which was, you know, politically pretty dodgy country, and, you know, it was a weird time to be there. And I drove to Belarus from Poland, and I get into Belarus, and we're going around all the different places, and I knew that there was 11 righteous still there. They had a very strange thing in Belarus where they didn't vaccinate anybody over the age of, I think, 50, because it's pointless. They're going to die anyway.
Oh.
I mean, they're mad. And so all the old people were dying. Like, it was tragic. Like, it was really, really tragic. So I kind of felt like I should go quickly. And we went, and I visited by all the righteous there, and I ended up in a small town. And they told me there was a lady who was one of the righteous amongst the nations. And I mean, it was like off road. Like, it was a very difficult drive to get to this village, and I get to her house, and it was absolutely like something out of the movies. I've never seen anything like this. I walked into her house, and thank goodness I was wearing a mask. The stench was horrendous to the point where I was vomited in my mask. Like, it was really bad. And I couldn't understand what on earth was going on. And a local, one of the people from the Jewish community, was helping me. And I said, what's this smell? They said, well, her toilet. I said, what do you mean? What's wrong with the toilet? I said, well, she doesn't have a toilet. That bucket. I said, you're kidding me. I said, where's the toilet? They said, there's no plumbing in this village. I said, what? How's that possible? Right?
Belarus, yeah.
Belarus, they're living without plumbing. And so I got over that. I gave her everything she needed, and bought her medication and all the things that she needed to be there, and I asked to tell her story. And she was a young girl when the war broke out, and in the village the Germans rounded up all the Jews, and, you know, this was already kind of the second part, right? So 1941, 1942, when the Germans took over the Soviet Union area. So they went through and pushed the Russians out, and the Jews were all rounded up and taken to a pit, forced to undress, and the very horrible stories of Jews being shot and falling into mass graves. And there was a little girl who her mother pushed her just as the bullets were coming. And so she fell into the pit, but was alive.
Mm.
And she realized not to move. And she spent about a day covered in blood and dead bodies and moaning, the worst things you could begin to imagine. And after a day in this pit, she heard that there was no one around anymore, and she crawled out of the grave. So this young bloodied girl crawling out of a grave. And she crawls out and doesn't know where to go, has no idea. And somehow ends up at this lady's mother's house. Now, her father was ill. She was living with her mother and her sisters. And they barely had enough food to keep themselves alive. This wasn't an easy time for anyone. But they agreed that they could not help but to take this girl in. And they kept her in the home. And this young lady, Lubov, who I visited, it was her responsibility to look after her.
Wow.
And she looked after her throughout the whole war. When the Germans would come, she'd run with her and hide in the forests. They'd come back, she'd hide her in other places. And this lady had saved a young Jewish girl. It says, obviously, in the Talmud and Gemara, you save one life as if you're saving the whole world. So even just this one story of this one rescuer, and coming back all these years later to see her living in this condition, completely forgotten. Was again, she's sitting there in her house as this small medal from Yad Vashem, from the state of Israel, this nice document, but barely any food. This was very, very difficult to see. So we helped her move into an old age home and all of this stuff. And that was just one case of many, many, many.
Wow. Fascinating. I understand that the organization now has a focus also on Ukrainian refugees. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So one of the things that being on ground in Eastern Europe has enabled us to do is to understand how it works there, right? Because it's different. Every country is different. And you have to also understand how to deal in different situations. So when the war started in Ukraine, suddenly, there's this mass exodus of people, of refugees, and a lot of Jewish refugees within that. 60, 70,000 Jews living in Ukraine pre-war now. And so suddenly these Jews start running. So the Jewish Agency comes to Poland from the body of the State of Israel that's meant to help people make Aliyah. And they didn't necessarily understand how to deal with everything on ground. The example I give is that, say all of a sudden 1,000 people turn up to shul, right? And you need to give them water. They don't have water. If you go to CVS, you're going to spend hours pulling bottle. But you're local, you know how it works here. You just go to Costco and take your Costco card and buy 1,000 bottles. It's easier. No one knew how to do that in Poland. Now, I already had the groundwork and the Costco card and everything else I needed to be able to do that. So this is how we started. So we immediately went into partnership with the Jewish Agency. And we're able to do things that other organizations weren't. So, I mean, one of the things that sounds simple, but for me was really important. And again, it was maybe perhaps definitely because of the lessons that I learned by sitting and learning from the righteous, it gave me an example of how to behave in this situation.
Right. So
the first thing that we did, you'd see families coming over, escaping with nothing. Jews. There was a doctor, a lawyer, accountant, whatever it was, doesn't make a difference. And it's them coming across, and they've got nothing at all besides documents. And suddenly they're rummaging through piles of used clothing. It's sad, and it's degrading, right? And especially today, when clothes don't cost much. If they do if you want to go to a boutique, but if you go to like Zara, wherever you're going, H&M, you could buy a t-shirt for $1. So what we did was, with the Jewish Agency, there were about 3 hotels that were created just for Jews initially. So 3 hotels in Warsaw were taken over, and any Jew coming across knew where to go, and they'd get to the hotel of the Jewish Agency. So in each of these hotels, I created what we call boutique stores, where basically I'd go and clean out an H&M. I'd buy everything and fill up a van. We'd bring it. We have volunteers who put it all out nicely, and people would come into our stores and they'd take whatever they needed for free. And it was this tiny act of chesed that gave them a feeling of feeling like a human again.
Wow.
And that was just on one level. And then, we're talking about the Holocaust survivors. And, I'll never forget walking to one of the hotels of the Jewish Agency where we were supporting the hotel, and the amount of wheelchairs we had to bring and adult diapers and really very difficult things. And I go in there and I see a very tall, like big man. He was clearly also very old. And I went and I sat with him, and I put my hand on his, and I said, "What's your story?" And one of the volunteers, they said, "Don't bother. He doesn't talk much. Like, he's clearly very upset." But I sat with him anyway, and he burst out crying. And he said, "Look," he said, "I can't believe this is happening." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I was 9 years old when the Holocaust broke out. We're Jews. We had to run. My family, all of us went to the train station, me, my brothers and sisters, and mother and father. And with all the mess at the train station, I got lost from my family.
Wow.
And I ended up alone, hiding in the forest with partisans. For the war, somehow I survived, hiding all alone. And now I find myself again at the train station,
Wow.
all alone again." And he came, and he had this small black bag with him, like tiny sports bag. And I went to move it. I could barely lift it. And I said, "What do you have in there?" He said, "Tin food and my documents." He just grabbed tins of food and ran. And I looked down at his feet, and he had flip-flops. He didn't have shoes on. He didn't even have time to put on his shoes.
Wow.
And so obviously that was actually very difficult. But he had size, probably USB about 15 size feet. It was quite difficult to buy sneakers for size 15. So even then, we have very strong social media. So I put on Instagram that I need someone to source me a pair of size 15 shoes. And one of the coolest sneaker stores in Warsaw reached out. And that evening they came and dropped me this like very cool pair of Nike Air Force Ones, like that, hundreds of dollars worth of shoe. And they're like, "Here you go, like gift." Wow. So they gifted us that, and I went, and this old man is now walking around. Is this Holocaust survivors walk around Israel with the coolest pair of shoes you've ever seen?
Wow.
So
the war in Ukraine broke out nearly a year ago, and these refugees, did they, the majority of them make Aliyah to Israel? They're in a holding pattern. What's the scene on the ground, so to speak?
So the majority, look, the thing is obviously that as everyone will know, that men from the age of 16 to 60 are unable to leave Ukraine. So it's mainly women and children and the elderly. So the majority of the Jews and people who felt Jewish, right? I mean, the number from 60,000 is probably inflated with a lot of people have some connection. But from the terms of women and children and elderly who feel Jewish and have that connection, almost all of them moved to Israel. Almost all of them made Aliyah. Whether they'll eventually stay in Israel, we don't know. But that's less of the point. Again, the family's broken, right? So when the war finishes, maybe they'll go back. Maybe the husband will join them. We'll have to wait and see. So most of the Jews ended up moving to Israel. There were some who received very big stipends to move to Germany, which I hate, but they did it anyway. It's not my position to say anything to anybody. But the amazing thing that Israel did was also take in the Holocaust survivors and the elderly Jews in a very special way, but they were straight into old age homes, into care facilities, and so on and so forth. So
amazing. So we're just getting ready to wrap up our conversation here and conclude the talk. I just want to know if there's any one nugget of advice, for younger people. You're somewhat unique in your age. Most people involved in the Holocaust education are a little older, but you've embraced this with a lot of idealism, and obviously this is your calling, it seems. So is there any kind of advice that you would give to, I don't know if I can say people our age, or even younger, as we're growing up in a time where things are not as certain as they used to be. We'll just leave it that, even in the United States, where it gets uncomfortable at times with anti-Semitism. So what kind of insights, or if something you might want to share for us to keep in mind?
I think that the main point is that at no point should we accept it. And I think the acceptance of anything like that is when problems begin to start. That, even when we look over our parents' generation at what they did, for example, with Russian Jewry, right? And you look at the protests that took place here in the United States, mass protests, and it helped. It helped. And almost everybody listening will know some Russian Jew who moved to America or Israel. Almost all of America played huge parts. A very good friend of mine, as a 3-year-old boy, escaped Belarus, came with his parents, ended up here in America, worked for President Clinton, He's now a very important person, Democratic Party in politics. And he is here as a result of the fact that people stood up and demonstrated and stood up and refused to let the situation be as it was. And I think that that's the biggest thing that our generation needs to understand, is that we can change things, and we do not have to accept things how they are. And especially when there's anti-Semitism, we have to stand up against it, and also be fearless. You know, the reason why I can walk in Poland as a proud Jew and really be unafraid is obviously because I believe in God, but it's also because we have the state of Israel. And what's the worst, right? It gets really bad. Never mind, get an airplane. Never mind, right? And I'm with, you know, in my own country with my own people, and with our own army that are able to protect us. And I think that for me, this is really the key to all of this, is that we just absolutely is not to be afraid, because there's no need to be. We don't need to be anymore. And I think that this perspective sometimes that we have of Jews of keeping quiet and not standing up to stuff, I think is incorrect and wrong. And I think especially now with that, and you know, honestly, like I speak to many friends of mine in America, and I've been here many, many, many times, and I see what's happening in the community. I spent time in Los Angeles, just now in New York. It's a frightening time to be here. It's unquestionable. Now, this has always happened through our history, right? And this is something else that when you understand history, you see that it comes in waves and things, and it will pass as well. But we definitely need to stand up and be strong. And if we've learned anything from the upstanders and from righteous and from survivors, it's not to be quiet.
Right. Well, on that optimistic note, I just want to bring our conversation to an end, and I just want to thank you profusely again for taking the time on your busy schedule. I also wanted to give you a bracha, I guess you say a birkat hedyot, because for your amazing vodat kodesh. It sounds like basically everything you're doing is a big kiddush Hashem. So you should God should give you lots of strength and courage and stamina to continue with your holy work. And you're making a big difference in the world, obviously, for a whole variety of demographics, from righteous non-Jews to Ukrainian refugees, and even to young people that need to learn about the past. So I just want to wish you lots of bracha v'hatzlacha, and thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure.